on marriage, and today is going to be just the same. With me is Pastor Staton Adams. Good day, Pastor Adams, and welcome to Marriage Encounter.
It's good morning, and it is a pleasure that we can be on again this morning. We are running a little behind time, but we will see how we're gonna make up. um, by no means, as we said, what we don't finish now, we continue. Just call somebody, um, tell them Marriage Encounter is on, and we continue our very, very interesting and important discussions on these issues.
Most definitely. We want to go right into a word of prayer at this time. Almighty Father, be with us as we share with our friends on radio, on the internet, important information on marriage. Even those who are not yet married, we pray that the information will prove meaningful to them as they prepare to take this important step. Guide our discussions today, we pray in your precious name. Amen. Last week, we were discussing, in fact, for the last few weeks, we have been discussing the whole matter. We're talking about conflicts and dealing with conflicts, with different types of conflicts. And for the past few weeks, we have been looking at when there is a conflict as a result of immaturity or brokenness of one person in the relationship. And we have been looking at the matter of accepting reality. And then we began to explore some of what we consider to be elements where there are issues in the relationship, relational abilities where people can't get close, can't communicate, can't sustain intimacy, their parental difficulties, emotional problems from past or from family of origin, lack of structure, self-discipline. And last week we spoke about financial inabilities, the inability to manage or to make money. Pastor, today we want to look at another area that sometimes people may have to accept reality to say, this is a problem in this relationship. This is a problem with me, or this is a problem with my spouse. And that has to do with sexual difficulties, maybe from fear, from past trauma, from shame, or other emotional factors.
Well, yes, this is a real issue. And there are a lot of marriages that are really, really severely affected in this area. And Dr. McNullen Joy said that our sexuality is part of our personality. And while I was discussing, I was at that particular marriage couple club the other night. And while I was sharing with them, I mentioned something about sexless marriages. And everybody said, what? Is there such a thing? I said, yes. And I began to tell them about why this could be and what are some of the issues. And I think I did border on mentioning some of the things that I will probably talk to this morning as we share in this very critical area. But it is an area, sexuality, sexual expression is a significant part of the marriage experience. In fact, theologically, it is the only bonding one fleshness experience that you can arrive at. There's no other way. And so this is a very, very critical, very, very important area, but that is not the only reason. There are about 5-7 reasons for the expression of sexual expression in marriage. And so these are very, very important. And this is a very crucial area that we are discussing here this morning.
So radio friends, just again to remind you, radio friends, those of you who are listening via the World Wide Web, we are talking about issues in the relationship. And it is, you mentioned, Pastor Adams, that when you use the term sexless marriages, that some folks at that marriage club you were at ask whether there is such a thing. I want to say that not only is there such a thing, it is a common thing, in fact, right? Yep. The other thing, of course, is sometimes people's response may not be genuine. Some persons who themselves may be experiencing a sexless marriage may ask just to give the impression that it is not so in their relationship. Because sometimes when people are having these issues, they really feel that they're the only ones who are having the issues, but they don't want anyone
Yeah.
else to know, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a common enough phenomenon that is important. And what we are saying here, just to provide context, what we are saying here is that if you recognize that there is a difficulty in your sexual experience, that difficulty may be coming from several sources. It may be fear, maybe you had a traumatic experience in the past. You know, you may have been oriented to see sex as a shameful thing, or there may be other emotional factors in your life that may be creating this particular challenge. What again we are saying is that if this is your reality, begin by accepting this is a reality. This is happening. Because the first step to solving a problem is admitting that there is a problem.
Yes, and Dr. Greene, I'm glad you piggyback on the statement that I made in reference to the Marriage Couple Club on what I said, because you see, I would venture to say, even say that this is a big one. And I may even suggest to you now that maybe Let's Talk should deal with this as a particular issue, as a separate issue. You probably will consult as a family therapist and a trauma psychologist and deal with this in its entirety, because this is a big one. Because you see, past traumatic experiences can disrupt a person's sexuality. Past traumatic experiences can seriously disrupt a person's sexuality. In fact, it can shape the development of their sexual self. It can actually shape the development of their sexual self. And so we are talking about distressing or disturbing events or conditions that overwhelm an individual ability to cope and to function. And psychologists they speak about adverse childhood consequences or experiences that have dire consequences that can follow you into your adult life and into marriage life. And this area is one of them. If you've had sexual issues, trauma, past traumatic sexual issues like incest, rape, or whatever, molestation, these are serious issues that can affect you in very critical ways, very serious ways in adult life, married life. And the literature, plenty of the literature is out there to say how this is a real thing and a real issue. So this is not just an ordinary issue that we are talking to this morning. That's why I said maybe we need to take Let's Talk for an whole hour, how much time you usually use to deal with this in its entirety, because this one is a big one, very big one.
In fact, just yesterday, I was listening to a program on BBC where this lady, after many, many years, was now sharing her experience of how, you know, in a war-torn country in Africa, that unfortunately, the soldiers, in fact, used sex as a weapon of war, and how they were raped and how it impacted her life, her ability to have children, her ability to enjoy a good married life. And
Yes.
it is something that we definitely do not want to overlook. You know, you spoke about those traumatic experiences from childhood. And when the trauma is so severe, you know, psychologically, the body goes through adjustments in order to cope as a coping mechanism. And some individuals may become so turned off that, you know, remembering can create a trigger to to relive the experience, and therefore renders that individual incapable of proper sexual response. So, you know, what we are saying effectively is, if you can accept the reality that something is happening, then you need help. Because unless you get the correct therapeutic treatment, this may continue to plague your relationship forever.
Well, not me, it will. Because you see, traumatic events and conditions, these conditions often result in emotional psychological and sometimes physical repercussions. So it's not just so, and if you have emotional issue will affect your intimacy level, your ability to trust somebody and to become intimate, sexual intimacy, and sexually intimate worse yet. You see, if the trauma had to do anything with sexuality at all. In fact, there are different types of traumas that hold the potential to derail a person's intimate life. They can be developmental trauma, complex trauma, or a single incident trauma can all compromise one's ability to bond. And one of the function of sexuality in marriage is bonding. That's the only way you become one flesh. I'll be talking about bonding now. This one fleshness that the Bible talks about in marriage and sexuality, that bonding is seriously jeopardized, which in turn can hamper our engagement in sexual desire or sexual pleasure. I mean, so the effect of trauma and sexuality are oftentimes complex and varies widely depending on the individual and the nature of the trauma. And in fact, trauma can affect an individual in about 9 or 10 ways. Sexual trauma itself or other adverse childhood conditions that have to do with one's sexuality can affect you in about 9 or 10 different ways. And you just mentioned one of them, the physical impact. You know, just the physical impact. We talk about the emotional impact. You know, flashback and triggers that you mentioned, their body image and self-esteem issues, you know, intimacy issues, disassociation.
Now, Pastor Adams, I don't want to interrupt the flow so much, but I want to slow you down because there are, I mean, so many things that you're sharing there that perhaps we need to explore a little bit. And I want, before before that list, I want to go back to the whole concept that you are mentioning there about the role of sex in marriage. And we're saying, I don't want our listeners to overlook the importance of this. We're going to get back to the various types of traumas and the impact they create, etc., which is why it is so important for us to accept reality. We'll understand that in some marriages, some individuals recognize that, nothing is happening sexually, and they resign themselves to live with their frustration. But the marriage bond, and I'm emphasizing the bonding element of sex, right?
Mhm.
If you are not being bonded physically, there is a relationship. We often hear psychologically there's a relationship between the physical and the emotional. And
Yes.
if that bonding is not taking place, it is going to create and lead to things like frustration, which will further create complications for your marriage emotionally and will push you further apart so that it becomes even more difficult for you to cope. And we have a cyclical effect that, let's take a man, for example. He becomes frustrated and he may get angry and lash out, and lashing out and speaking harsh words to the woman will create a situation where she's emotionally pained and cannot respond sexually. And so it's a cycle. So we are saying we don't just want to view sex as an activity that produces pleasure. It creates bonding that is important to the oneness in the relationship. We go back to Genesis. They twain shall be one. It's a theological concept. It's with divine intent that God made it that way. And so we should not just settle, because people make all kinds of excuses, oh, I'm going through menopause, so don't expect anything, or I'm busy at work and I'm tired when I come home. We need to understand the role that sex plays and appreciate that at different stages in your life, you're going to have different conditions that may require adjustments, etc. But do understand that it is a significant bonding element in the relationship.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that because we can't feign ignorance on these matters. As Johnson Trotman used to say, ignorance may not cause, ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance may cause blisters. And so the thing is, what we're actually saying, accept the reality, and not just the reality, but get the knowledge as to why. If one or either person in the relationship has a sexual issue, the educational part of that is so important. The historical educational part of this is so important if some situation is going to be resolved. In fact, there's a three-step point. We don't have program time to maybe talk about that. There's a three-step point that you can take if you are really serious about improving your sexuality or correcting what went wrong, whether it's a traumatic past experience or whatever. People can get help and release from these situations. That is what we are saying. If you don't get help and release, in fact, these traumas and these past experiences could go with you to the grave. Right. One of my textbook has to do with sexual trauma in childhood and how it can affect you right to the grave if not addressed and dealt with. And so we are talking to the issue as a reality. And that is why when we are examining the marriageability of people and profiles, and so we are mindful of where they're coming from, the family of origin, what existed there. Was there any issue there in relation to all these things that we are discussing here this morning, and how are they addressed? All of these are serious factors, right? Where the person is coming from, what are they bringing, the baggages, emotional, psychological, physical baggages. All these things are very important.
And Pastor, even the way we are oriented, some parents would in their own way say to their children, avoid sex, it's dirty, and that in itself can create a picture in people's mind that sex is a dirty thing. And they may grow up always thinking that sex is dirty. And so their outlook, the concept that they have of sex, they relate it to something derogatory and never really enjoy the bliss that God intends for it to be, because they're associating it with some sinful act. And even when they get married, they're still ashamed and not comfortable sharing freely.
Right. That social conditioning is a problem, because yes, we have to know that, again, family of origin, did our parents talk to us frankly? Did they explain to us? Did they help us to feel healthy about our own sexuality as children? When should they talk to us about our sexual awareness and explain sexuality in an age-appropriate way? These things, our family life education says that children must be taught and educated about their sexuality age appropriately. It's not something now, in these modern days, you can't tell children that a baby came from an airplane and was dispatched in some cabbage fields somewhere. You can't tell children these, because they do sex education in school and they're going to know that you're not telling them the truth, right? They do sexual education in school. But I believe that the first place that the child should learn sexual education is in the home, the family, where that setting is a one where you can trust those people, and to give you the right information about your own personal sexuality, and that's important. So yes, sometimes the shame and the guilt that we feel is because of the social conditioning, the wrong type of education we have had coming up. So apart from the actual trauma experiences, yes, the shame and all of this and the guilt and all these things could come because, growing up, our parents never spoke to us about things sexual. My parents never talked to us, like frankly, about sexuality and these kind of things, because it was a taboo subject. As you said, it was some dirty sort of thing, but sex is sacred, right? Because God gave that gift in the domain of marriage, right? It's not exclusive. Sex is not sinful. Sex is sacred. It
In
was
fact,
God's wedding gift to the married couple.
you started by a quotation earlier.
You're listening to Second Advent Radio 101.5 FM. Stay tuned in for our upcoming program.
Today on The Voice of Prophecy, things that go bump in the night. If you've ever wondered if people really hear from beyond the grave, if they really get visited by dead relatives, you're not going to want to miss this episode, because we are going to uncover some mind-blowing information that might just come as a bit of a surprise. So stick around. I'll be right back. And welcome to a very special edition of The Voice of Prophecy. I'm Sean Boonstra, your host for the next half hour or so, and today we're going to talk about things that go bump in the night. And if that sounds a little bit spooky, well, you're absolutely right. We're going to be talking about paranormal activity, visits from beyond the grave, people who claim that the dead are actually speaking to
Or how their father may have treated their mother. You know,
Yes.
so having a positive concept is important. I want to say, but we have to view sex as something more than just an act that takes place behind closed doors.
Right. It is more than an act. It is more than an act. It has to do with the general well-being, the general relationship. That is what I would say. In fact, when I make a presentation, the couples on sexuality, in my conclusion, I say that it has nothing to do with all of the information and the tapes and the gimmicks and all that. It has to do with the relationship between the two people, the emotional connectivity, the intimacy that they enjoy together. That is what really redound into the fulfillment in terms of fulfilled sexuality, really. Yeah, and so you are right on point. It is more than the physical encounter behind closed doors, right? It is the overall relationship that lends to the sexual expression and what is seen, right? Yes. So
Now, go ahead.
So we don't want to miss that critical point that you were making in relation to how all of these things ultimately come back to the individual and how the individual sees his or herself in terms of the sexuality. And you went back to quote Genesis, right? That Adam and Eve, as one of my teachers said, they used the acronym NANA. They were naked and not ashamed. So if people have guilt and self-esteem problems and all of that because of the orientation and how they were taught, how this thing was explained to them, how sexuality was explained to them, we have to let our children know, we have to let our grown-up, our teen, adolescent know that they were wonderfully and fearfully made by God, and that includes their sexuality, you see, to
That's
debunk
right.
a lot of this myth. Right, we are wonderfully and fearfully made, and that includes our sexuality. So when God pronounced very good on the creation, that included the sexuality as well, right?
That's right.
It was now very good, male and female, naked and not ashamed, right? You know,
Certainly.
so
Now, in the next 5 or so minutes that we have before we end today, if we can go back a little bit to now trauma. You did share several types earlier, and I did say slow down because we don't want to miss important elements. So I did go back to exploring that element of the bonding that sex creates. But maybe now we can speak to the effects of past trauma on the individual and how that may be impacting the relationship. Because you see, when an individual gets married, a few weeks ago we were talking about baggage, the baggage that we bring to the relationship, and how sometimes the baggage has some garbage, some experiences that are weighty that may cause overweight, some unresolved issues that are there, etc. And individuals who have had traumatic experiences that have not been dealt with, an individual may get married, you know, and I shared, I was listening to this program about another program I was listening to yesterday, actually, with a Japanese war and how the Japanese soldiers establish what they called, what term did they use? entertainment centers or something to that effect, which really was a sex house where they captured these women from the enemy and placed them in this house so that their soldiers could satisfy themselves sexually.
Wow.
And the trauma that creates. When you can imagine that a woman is being raped repeatedly by different men, it really has a significant destabilizing effect on her emotional well-being. And an individual who comes through something like that, too ashamed to talk to anybody, and later on gets married and have never dealt with it, it can really become a significant challenge in the marriage relationship.
Obviously, and that experience alone, that is the complex trauma that we're talking about. That's complex trauma. That's the way that you explained it. That is complex trauma. And then the individual will respond to that vary. And but regardless, it's going to affect your sexuality in many ways, between 9 and 10 ways, and I was mentioning some of them. I just wanted to give the various ways by way of education, and maybe when we return, we can probably talk to them like individually. But yes, physical impact, the emotional impact, you know, the flashback and the triggers, and you alluded to that earlier. You can also have a mental health problem of disassociation, and disassociation is a major mental disorder. You know, dissociation disorder, which formerly referred to years ago as split personality. All of these are real issues. Avoidance, communication issues, body image, and self-esteem. Let's pick up emotional impact, because remember we talked some time ago about the intimacy. We talked about spiritual intimacy, emotional intimacy, physical intimacy, sexual intimacy. Well, emotional intimacy has a direct correlation to physical intimacy, because you see, if you cannot trust somebody in this emotional way, then you cannot make yourself vulnerable, because in the actual sexual experience, you're actually making yourself vulnerable to another human beings who, from all intent of purposes, and that is why this thing is sexuality and sexual expression is confined to the marriage bed, that context, because you're making yourself ultimately vulnerable to somebody who you trust.
I wish we had time, you know, I wish we had more time here, because, you know, when sometimes, you know, in premarital counseling, you orient with the assumption that the couple you're counseling are Christians, they've never had sex before. You sometimes have to talk about what is going to be expected at the honeymoon, because some persons, for the first time in their life, they're going to be appearing naked before a man or woman.
Yeah.
You know, and you're talking about making yourself vulnerable to the other individual. You're really giving of yourself.
Yes, that is what it is.
It is sharing from a very, very deep level, you know. So we really can't overlook it. Our time is up, Pastor.
Our time is up. Oh,
yes. I'm really sorry. We just have to wrap up now. But we're going to pick it up from here next week, you know, because
we continue.
you know, you're speaking about emotion. I want to talk about the avoidance and all those other elements, because they have very significant implications.
Right. That is why I said this is a big one.
Yes, it is indeed. So friends, I know that we're talking about some very significant areas here. Join us next week again for the continuation. Of course, this program is repeated at 6 on Thursdays, and at I believe it's 2 p.m. or on Saturdays. But until then, we have to run now. We will be back next week again for another encounter. If you have questions, comments, or concerns, it's marriageencounter@slcadventist.org. That is marriageencounter@slcadventist.org. That's all the time we have. God bless.
Okay. God bless all of you.